Welcome to Low to Grow, the podcast transforming life's toughest moments into personal motivation. I'm Annie, a Forbes Under 30 technology founder whose entrepreneurship journey ran alongside a mental health awakening. In each episode, I sit down with inspiring individuals who have each faced incredible challenges, tackled it head on, and emerged stronger on the other side. Together, we'll explore their stories, unpack the lessons that they have learned, and also understand how they managed to turn challenges into opportunities for personal growth. Whether you're navigating uncertainty in your personal life or simply looking for motivation to keep going, this is your space for the honest conversations that you will want to hear. If this resonates with you, hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you know someone who's struggling, share this with them. You might just prompt them to take the first step towards better mental health. Now, let's dive in. Welcome to today's episode of Low to Grow with Lily Elsner, co-founder and CEO of Jack Fertility, the world's first postal-based fertility testing for men, offering lab-based semen analysis results without needing to set foot in a clinic. Jack Fertility has received press coverage by British GQ, Men's Health, the Sunday Times, and many more. But what makes Lily's story compelling isn't just her own entrepreneurial success. Lily had a rich corporate career taking her across the US before finally arriving for her MBA in Oxford. Now, in this episode, we will explore the experiences that have shaped the drive that Lily has today in creating a company that tackles a very important area of health, fertility for men. Now, Lily, thank you so much for being on this podcast. I want to start by asking you, who do you think will benefit most from listening to our conversation today?
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Annie, and really appreciate being here. In terms of who I think will benefit most, early stage folks who are just starting out in their career to people considering a pivot, because my big message is it's never too late to follow your passion. And similarly, you know best what you are capable of. And so I say just do it. So whether you're earlier, later, hopefully I can share a lot from what I've learned on my founder journey and similarly choosing not to stay in corporate.
So, Lily, how did your own career start?
Taking you way back to the very beginning, I grew up thinking for sure I was going to be a physician. From as early as I knew what a physician was, I wanted to heal people and make them feel better and get to sort of nerd out on science while applying it to human health to make the world a better place. And what I discovered from first going to a science and math high school to then studying biology and then ultimately discovering bioethics and philosophy at Wellesley College, an all-women's college in Boston, through experiences in not only research labs, but also clinics, and then working for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in Washington, D.C., I realized being a physician was a terrible fit for me. I'm too much of a softie. I had to work so much on professional distance. I was like haunted by every patient I ever saw and started uncovering the major issues in US healthcare and just sort of the way the system is set up and seeing the bigger issues that most people were sick, not because they were exposed to various types of diseases, but rather they were suffering from sort of systemic deprivation and poverty. And so I realized that was not the right role for me. And I think it's really hard, especially when you're young and driven and gunning for something. I mean, I never considered anything outside of being a physician or at least something within sort of the allied health professions. And it was really shocking to suddenly, despite being top of my class and graduating with honors and doing all of these things, to realize that actually this role that I thought was perfect and all I could ever see myself doing was actually really badly suited to me and who I am and what my strengths are. And so ultimately, through the mix of sort of asking myself why I wanted to do this so much, what was it I really wanted to achieve, I really was trying to fix some of these deep-seated problems, as I imagine many of us do. But more importantly, I wanted to make that change on a large scale. And I realized for me and for, again, my skill set, there were so many things I didn't even know about. And that was particularly learning from the US Department of Health and Human Services. So I started seeing how the sausage gets made in terms of healthcare. And there's so many areas I didn't know about. And furthermore, I started learning what my strengths were and what was valued and what areas, something that was holding me back, for example, in science was actually a massive strength in whether it was corporate communications or PR, or all of these things are really valued when they're in the context of whatever the discipline is. And I really looked back and was like, actually growing up in a rural area, I really only knew teachers, pharmacists, people I just interacted with my everyday life. And I realized I'd never even met an attorney. And especially being a philosophy major as well as biology major, I decided to follow that well-trodden path to a big law firm actually after I graduated, because I really wanted to find out what what these lawyers that were making all the laws that were dictating healthcare in the US, what they were doing. So I discovered this amazing world that was so much nicer than STEM in the sense of life sciences, because I was like, these laws are written down. I'm not having to observe so much of the scientific method and come to conclusions. Rather, it was quite easy to say this is either within scope or out of scope of legislation, or that's been litigated and that hasn't. So I absolutely loved working at a big law firm in mergers and acquisitions in New York. Discovered that so many of the things that I was having to sort of detract from my personality to be a better scientist were actually huge boons, and I could just sort of be myself at work and be great at what I did. I actually got really interested in mergers and acquisitions board governance. And so I ended up going to Capital One Bank and working for their board of directors, where I actually realized all of the things I was good at and all the things I really enjoyed, from strategy to risk management to getting into the weeds on numbers, was actually what board directors do and leaders of companies do. And that process of really empowering myself and learning what it takes to be in one of those high and sort of valued positions, but realizing but there's so much more than just the title that comes into that, and realizing where my skills were and what I love to do. And again, that sort of systemic level of change could happen. And so for me, it was that process of not forcing myself to do something just because society or other expectations said you have to have a terminal master's degree or you have to have this thing to be perceived as great. And for me, it was so much about the satisfaction of the job, but also realizing that at the end of the day, I'm the only one who matters in terms of perception, because I'm the one who has to live with my choices. And so ultimately, that's what ended up driving me to get my MBA and ultimately to come to the UK, is because I started getting really interested in the relationship with regulators and banks. And the FCA in the UK has a really interesting regulatory relationship with fintech. And because I was primarily with the board working with our regulators, I realized actually this is so fascinating. Some system has figured it out. And so I came here to the UK initially thinking that I would work in fintech, and actually rediscovered my scientific roots at Oxford, realized I could speak corporate and translate it to the scientists and vice versa. And that's a whole job set in itself. So worked as head of strategy for an AI drug discovery company for about a year and a half. And then during that time, my co-founder and I came up with the idea for Jack Fertility. And we decided, you know what? We've learned from the best. We've seen how all these leaders and decision makers make their choices. And let's get in the driver's seat ourselves. Let's see. We've talked a big game. Are we really ready for that challenge? And it's been an amazing experience since.
That is quite the career journey. And it sounds like you really took the process and the time to try different things and to really learn from each situation that you were in, where your strengths are and where you can better apply them. And that's what you then seeked out for your next experience. Listening to you talk about it, it sounds very straightforward, but I'm sure that when you were going through it, maybe sometimes the next step wasn't that clear. Were there any points where you were uncertain about what you would next do?
Definitely. Yeah, it sounds so clear in retrospect. But the biggest and probably most painful decision was to not go to med school. Especially that unlearning of saying, I've committed to this. And even when you're so young, I was like, for half my life slash all the times I can remember, I've been gunning towards this one goal and thinking, especially with the narrative around resilience and grit and sticking things out and making sure that you overcome all these barriers. I think I learned the hard way what the difference is between overcoming like the obstacles that are worth contending with, and then actually what I was discovering, which was this is the wrong fit for me. And there's so many ways to be involved in whatever area you're passionate about, but it doesn't have to be, I don't need to be a doctor to work in healthcare. I don't need to be necessarily clinician to make a huge difference to human health. And that there's so many things that just because I said I wanted to do X, it was really not really that role that I wanted to do necessarily, but it was the impact that that role has. And so, yeah, especially saying I'm not going to go to med school, I'm going to go into law. I think everyone was really shocked. But at the end of the day, by doing that, I realized, my family's still going to love me. My friends are still going to support me. And then that made it a little easier when I decided I took the LSAT, I applied to loads of law schools. I got everyone to write recommendation letters, and you have to put yourself out there and say, I'm going to law school, and tell everyone you're going to law school, and then turn around and say, yeah, actually, after I thought about it, and after a school asked me for several $100,000, I don't care that much and I don't really want to go. And again, what you learn is that usually your harshest critic is yourself. Because really, most of your closest family and supporters, they just want you to be happy, or they want you to achieve whatever they're bringing to that relationship. And thankfully, I'm lucky enough to have a really supportive family and to not have a lot of pressures that many people have of whether it's income or support or other types of caregiving. But really, it was that trying to find that fit, because I knew I was, again, to be a lawyer, I was going to have to change so much about myself. And I already seen inside a big law firm, I'd seen inside of going in-house, and I knew that that was not the career I wanted to have. I'm looking 10, 15, 20 years down the line. And so I think that was one of the most difficult decisions. Again, I was like, now I've done it again. And then saying, oh, I'm going to go to business school was also, it made a lot more sense then, because I was saying, look, I want to pivot, and the MBA is so flexible that it gives you a lot of different routes into whatever you want to do. However, it really made me sort of strengthen my core, not necessarily physically, but emotionally, and in terms of my galvanizing what I was looking for out of my career and out of my purpose. The other great thing about an MBA is that so much is done on personal development and professional development that I didn't need to have it all figured out when I got there. It really crystallized as I went through the process. So yeah, it was really, really hard. But I think I knew it was the right decision for me, because again, I was the one who was going to have to sit there, whether it was in a law firm or in a courtroom and having to do this job. And I knew that was just not the reality I wanted to live. And I was really the only one that had the consequences of that. So, yeah. And it got easier every time. I'll say that too.
Throughout that process, Lily, did you have any mentors who guided you through that? Or was it something that you were able to approach by yourself?
Well, it's a great question, because I was always looking for mentors. And I think many people have a very clear, like, oh, this person has guided me consistently and consistently. And I've now since, and actually especially through business school, have met some folks that I would name as mentors. But actually I had a really lucky experience in some ways, in that I had the right people at the right time, who in some ways I have kept up with, and in other ways realized that those were the right people at that time, and we've sort of grown apart. But for me, the mentors that really helped were people who backed me and sort of lifted me up, in the sense of identifying my talent, or saying, you're really great at this, especially thinking about in high school and college. But I will say that a lot of it was learning how to listen to my inner voice and know, both through the analysis of the feedback I was getting, because sometimes I wasn't great at stuff. And I was like, I should be really good at this, right? I should be really good at everything else about my CV tracks, that should really love doing X, Y, or Z, because I'm getting results in this area and I keep getting awards, or I keep getting high grades. But then realizing, like, I frankly didn't really care. I'm a competitive person, so I liked winning to an extent, but beyond that, I was like, there has to be more to life. And so in terms of mentors, people I was able to vocalize that to, even if, for an hour or two, there were a number of people who've been really helpful in that sense, even if I didn't know them that well, who, particularly thinking about, for example, at a law firm, chatting to some of the senior partners and saying, oh, would you have done anything differently? Or what would you do in my shoes? Whether they responded either positively saying, yeah, you've got what it takes and you should do it. But also then hearing sort of what they weren't saying, of like, you're not going to enjoy this. Like, yeah, you can do it and you'd be great at it. But would you like to live that life? So, yeah, in each of my roles, I had the positive mentors who backed me. For example, I had an amazing boss at Sherman and Sterling, Maria Zano, who taught me, frankly, everything I know that's made me great at my jobs. But that was because one, she's spectacular, but also there's a lot she told me there where she said to me, she was like, "You are not going to be a lawyer. Like, you are not going to like being a lawyer. You can absolutely do it, but you're going to hate it." And she was right. She was totally right. So, yeah, I think people put a lot of pressure on having a mentor, and it's great to cultivate a mentorship relationship. But I also think that's a narrative that often puts a lot of pressure on people. So I would also say to folks listening, don't worry about having a formal mentor unless that's something you really want to achieve, and rather take what you get in terms and leverage that as you develop your further relationships throughout your career.
So from the mentor that you had, what was like the most resounding piece of advice that she gave you? Apart from, of course, telling you that you won't enjoy being a lawyer and practicing in the field.
That was pretty, I mean, it was great because she had seen me work for about a year at that point, and she just said, she was like, "You are gonna run a company someday." And I was like, "Oh,
Wow.
really?" I was like shocked because and never in a million years did I think I would become a founder either, because I'm very interested in like how organizations are run and policies and governance, and how, like, from that, almost like, again, being a scientist, right? I'm like so fascinated by the order of things and how one thing affects another and sort of testing things out. But that piece of advice, one, was to even consider something outside of the narrative I was telling myself in my head. But the other really was to think about what I wanted my life to look like, and that sort of bigger picture of like, how do you want your days to be? What do you want your hours to look like? And she actually had a lot of really great advice about everything, for especially as a woman, like thinking about building a family, when you want to have that, what kind of flexibility and things that you wouldn't otherwise think about childcare, planning your career around that. But also just genuinely, like, do you want to work in downtown Manhattan? Like, do you want to have a big sort of skyscraper kind of job, or do you want to have, a home office, or all of these things? And I think she did a really good job, and many other mentors that I've had. And actually, a great book that I'm sure many people recommend is like Designing Your Life, where you think about like really the minutia of what you want your future career to look like, and being really honest with yourself. I think it's really easy, especially in the age of social media, to get swept up in sort of the images around what success looks like, but also getting to the core of like, how do you want to feel at the end of the day? And like, one of my favorite things that I always say in mentorship relationships, when I mentor people, and what I learned, again, the hard way, but also made a lot of, whether it was not going to med school, not going to law school, some of these things, it was like, I always say, choose what you want to complain about. Because I thought at one point I wanted to go into the charity sector in healthcare. And I realized like there's so much strife around fundraising and navigating so many of the different aspects. And I was like, these are not complaints that I want to have, because the stakes feel so high, and just emotionally that's really hard for me. And part of why I mean, again, just transparently, why I went into this big law firm is I was like, it's rare that budget is a concern. And I wanted to try that out. As you can relate, and being in labs and in all sort of STEM subjects, there's so much you're always thinking about, and these various risk factors that you're trying to mitigate. And for me, I wanted to try out the sort of fancy, I mean, literally Suits was shot outside my building in New York. And so yeah, that's a very vivid depiction of what my life looked like. And then at the bank, I wanted to sort of see what that would look like. And similarly, coming to the UK, and giving myself permission to try, I think, was another major point. Because I mean, in all of these things, yeah, I didn't go to med school straight out of college. Like, you can go to med school anytime, or whatever health profession. Similarly, you can go back to law school anytime. What I wanted to do is really take advantage of the opportunities that came my way, especially when I had an opportunity to like really test myself before I committed, which is a long way of saying that is probably the biggest piece of advice outside of, just reading me and giving me that feedback that my mentor gave me.
And how do you feel that, your earlier kind of different corporate experiences influence how you lead now at Jack Fertility?
Yeah, how I lead. I think the most incredible gift I got from those jobs was getting to see how you do this on a global scale, and sort of planning for being at that level. I think you can know too much. I think that's a bit of that was a struggle I had to overcome when I was starting the business, because you're used to having to manage so many different stakeholders in my roles. Even so, at Capital One, I was working with the entirety of a federally regulated bank, with many different diversified financial services. And so I'm dealing with 60 plus people for one board meeting, plus all the board directors and their staffs and this and that. Versus when I'm planning for a board meeting for Jack, it's me and Nick. You kind of go from such extremes, but at the same time, like, we have massive aspirations for the company, and sort of knowing what I need to do now and do it in a risk managed way. And also to be ready when the big opportunities come. That was an amazing experience to do that without having to worry about the sort of extreme risks that come along with a startup. So, for example, knowing how to set up like legal agreements from day one to make sure that make sure we don't get sued, or our IP isn't protected, or some of these really core things I got to learn from the best at, in the law firm or similarly in the bank. And tricks about leadership in terms of the vision that I want to project, I got to learn from, again, so many different really masters of the craft through the consultants we had, or the advisors that the organization had. And I got paid to do it. That's what was the other amazing thing about all of this, is like getting paid to learn at that caliber, and then have that sort of doubled down upon when I paid to learn at Oxford. And then sort of had that iterative approach as I worked in the startup before this, and now getting to test it. So those have been the major influences, I'd say, on my leadership so far.
And how are you finding running your own company, and especially as a female founder?
The gender aspect is definitely an interesting one, but I do love it. I think part of why Nick and I started this company initially was from Nick's lived experience of trying to get tested during COVID. And he came to me as his science friend and said, why doesn't this test exist? Like, why can't I mail in my sperm when we're doing PCR tests through the post? Everyone's sending every type of fluid through the post. And I said, look, the livestock industry entirely runs on artificial insemination, often also sent through the post. So we need to figure this out. And so for me, I think mixing the urgent need of the mission, as we discovered, how prevalent infertility is, that sperm count's down almost 60% over the last 50 years. And then same thing, there's about 1 in 6 couples experience infertility. All of that data was there, and we realized how much people were having to go through needlessly because male fertility is so treatable. So the mission piece was really important. But to your question, we really were ready to break out of that corporate mindset. And I think why I was unhappy at most of my job, like, because of course I'm painting a really rosy picture of all of those roles. They were brutal in terms of working really intensely, really late into the night. I mean, if I left the office while I was at the law firm before 10 p.m., like, that was an early night, and was there usually between 7:30 and 8, worked most weekends. And loved it in a lot of ways, but also realized like how much of my life and my autonomy I was giving up to those systems, and realizing that I had very little control. And so it was all great when it was going well, but especially when things got more difficult, I really hated not being in control. And so this was an amazing opportunity with Jack to not only test and passionately pursue fixing the massive societal problem, again, with an amazing business behind it in terms of how we were addressing it and why we chose to make it a business and a health tech company. But really, at the end of the day, we were like, we want to find out if we've been criticizing every manager or boss or whoever we've ever had. Is it really them, or are we the problem? And that's what's been extraordinary, is getting, like I said, and described it as being in the driver's seat, is pushing ourselves and doing things that scare us, or doing things that we don't know anything about, and trying to find the humility to ask and find out from others how to do things, and admit when we don't know, which I've always found a little bit tough.
And Lily, just kind of looking back on all of your experiences, including the ones that you have had at Jack Fertility, um, When do you think that you were maybe, I guess, at your lowest point or the most uncertain about where your life or your career is going? And how did you get out of that stage?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, being again transparent, trying to build, we started building Jack Fertility in 2022, which coincided with sort of the start of all the inflation, like the market beginnings of whether we turn it a recession or not, like the slowdown in capital funding for startups. And so we went from being these like excited MBAs launching this company to realizing that the early stage capital markets are there's almost no capital for early stage companies, especially in hardware and especially in consumer health. And so, despite doing our absolute best and making these beautiful materials and pitching hundreds of investors and getting nothing but really positive feedback over and over, everyone's like, you're doing all the right things. There's just, you're pitching to brick wall basically because there's no money there. That was really tough, especially because we've, of course, being seasoned professionals at this and leveraging Nick's background and consumer insights. I mean, we did hundreds of interviews with not only individuals themselves, men, thinking about their fertility, women planning for their families, fertility experts, GPs, all of these different folks, and thousands of digital marketing surveys validated this to the extent it's really possible. And then saying to investors, like, here's every possible green flag. Please just fund this in all sorts of colorful ways, pitching, and having it be no. And just saying either whether the fund doesn't have any money or they don't invest that early, and hearing no over and over and over again, knowing that we've not only done our best, but we're exceeding all expectations and getting every 360 feedback on what we've done and saying like, rip this apart, say whatever you need to say, like don't no holds barred, and just realizing that like your best, it's not that your best isn't good enough, but you're just not in the right place at the right time. And I would say that was probably our lowest point, and particularly actually to your question about being a female founder, is realizing how real and how deep that bias is, especially pitching as the CEO and often by myself. I had some really extraordinary moments where I was like, oh my God, you are not seeing me for my accomplishments, my CV, my skills, my background. Like you're seeing a woman and bringing all these different biases, is particularly to investment conversations where, for example, last summer we were pitching a lot and I just had so many in quick succession people say to me just these shocking things, and really realizing that they were not only not taking me seriously, but frankly thought I had no idea what I was talking about. And you sort of get into this deep cycle of saying, is it me? Am I, you questioning everything, like maybe I am really bad at this, or maybe, all of my other normal metrics of success are telling me such mixed messages. And I think that was really my lowest because I was like, I've done everything right. Followed the podcast. I've followed I have a degree from Oxford that says I know what I'm talking about, yet that doesn't seem to, nothing matters.
What was like the worst thing that a potential investor has said to you?
That's a great question. I mean, there's sort of I would say the things that hurt the most were, one, I had someone really question me whether I knew what an acronym was for customer acquisition cost. And I thought it was like a sort of, oh, ha ha ha, polite kind of thing. And then he was like, no, do you know what the acronym is? And I thought he was making some sort of rhetorical point, but he genuinely was asking me. I was like, not only do I have an MBA, I've been doing this for 2 years. Like frankly, anyone
Wow.
in consumer would know what consumer is. And also, this is like our third conversation. Like, how dare you ask me? Who else do you ask that question? Do you know what it means? Like, just genuinely, and I'll share that also that was in the context of like so many other things where he kept like questioning. Again, I was like, oh, is this a big picture question? And he was like, no, like, can you define this? Can you define that? Do you know what that means? I was like, would you ask Nick that? Like, not to mention, I think the other very common thing, and one of the other worst things that's happened was at the final, it was like a final investor committee where I think people always think Nick is the scientist, and because he's a man with glasses on, and Nick has not taken science since high school, which is totally fair. That's not his specialism. And frankly, nor should he need to, given what he's working on and what his professional background is. But it's so shocking where we'll be in a conversation, they'll look at Nick and be like, "Oh, I get why you're here." And then they look at me and say, "This happened at IC. Someone said, 'So Lily, why are you here?'" I was like,
What's your answer to that?
I mean, my answer was, not only is my background perfectly suited to this, but if you're asking about a consumer product, like, our primary customer is women. Like, if you're going to say, oh, this needs to be built by your ideal customer profile, which I can define an ICP as, and that's a hard thing. It's hard not to get bitter about this and sort of defensive, because it is really shocking. But my answer was, I'm like, I'm building this product for women like me and for families like ours, and for really understanding our market. But also, my CV is perfect for this. Like, if you saw my CV, you'd be like, of course she's, and you probably wouldn't know it's a she, but yeah, of course I run this company. Why are you here?
Picking up on a point that you mentioned just now, like you said, you're building like a consumer product and the kind of like target customer would be women, but it's Jack's Fertility, and I thought it was about semen testing. Could you explain a bit more about that?
Yeah, perfect. And I appreciate you asking, because it's very true. I mean, it is a very inherently male test. So the reason that we are targeting it towards women is that women have a very much more direct relationship with their fertility. So everything from making the decision to have children, as well as thinking about getting fertility testing. There's so much that's been done in femtech, and amazing brands like Fertility, for example, has been really great about developing the narrative around getting tested before you start trying for children. And as the average age of parents is now increasingly into the mid 30s, there's so much that you can do prior to trying for children that will improve outcomes, will improve the health of the pregnancy and the health of the resulting child. And what I get often, especially from angel investors, when I pitch Jack and they say, it's going to be really hard to convince men to get tested. And that's where I initially am like, actually, we've done a huge amount of research that says, especially millennial and Gen Z men are already thinking about this. They just don't have a way to get tested. But really, especially for our initial launch, there's so many women who have gotten tested and are trying to convince their partners to get tested. And that's really the major reason men don't get tested, is the lack of access to appointments and the barriers through the NHS. Like, you have to actively try and conceive for a year in a heterosexual relationship before you can get on a list to get a semen analysis. And then the waiting lists are 3 to 4 months, usually depending on your trust. And so if you're trying for a baby, every month matters, and people are so used to being able to kind of on demand, think of the Amazon Prime generation, like, we're so used to being able to have whatever we want pretty much as soon as we want it, versus with fertility, there's a lot you have to get right to be able to conceive. And then if there's something wrong, it takes so long. And especially as people are waiting to have children, if you're proactive, there's so much you can do, versus when you're reactive, it gets very expensive very quickly. And the quickest way to do that is to overcome all of these massive user issues of saying, instead of pay loads of money to go to Harley Street, regardless of where you live in the UK, go do something really awkward and embarrassing and emasculated on the clock in a little room, or in most places they don't even have sample rooms, they have a disabled bathroom, to get some results that you don't really know how to understand. Like, there were just so many issues, and that's why we chose to do the harder path of taking Jack direct to consumer, because that demand is there and people are ready to get tested. But I think we always call the female partner in a heterosexual relationship a CFO, the chief fertility officer. And they usually are they're making not only all the buying decisions for the household, but also for the fertility planning. So that's our first customer will actually be women for this.
That's a really interesting insight, actually. I don't think I would have thought of that, but it completely makes sense. One other question. Some young professionals, they might be working in corporate, they might be starting their own company, and I feel like women will experience both spoken and also unspoken bias. What would your advice be to them? How did you manage to stay motivated when you were facing all of those rejections when you were pitching, and I guess sometimes even day to day as well?
Yeah, I really appreciate you asking. I'll be honest, I'm still figuring that out because it's a monumental thing to contend with and to try and overcome. And I would say the one thing is it is real. Like I often when I mention gaslighting, often that's what's even more pernicious about the unintentional bias is that you not only spend the time and have this reaction to that bias, but then you have to sort of go through the spiral of, well, was that bias? Was that on purpose? Am I being too sensitive? And it can really take over your mindset. And especially, I've contended with that a lot in corporate environments. And I think the most important thing you can do to navigate that is first develop something like I like to call it like your own board of directors and really sort of map out the skills that each member of that board has. So, for example, I think of mine as usually like my mother, a few of my close MBA friends who are very, they're in either in a similar industry, have been in my shoes. I may not convene the board all at once, but I sort of have the same question to all these different members. I usually have some guy friends on there and say, hey, do you think this is normal for somebody to say that? That's been particularly helpful, especially within venture conversation, like investor conversations, because I'm like, am I being too sensitive about this? And they'll either say, yeah, I wouldn't worry about that, or oh my God, or anywhere in between. And then finally, people who are much more senior or people who are really values aligned to me who can help me sort of stay my path. But I'm particularly bad, and I'll share hopefully again to be helpful to others. Like I will really like sort of marinate on things and I'll get really obsessed with thinking about stuff. And what I've learned through contending with the brutality of big law and big banking is that you have to just talk it out and then let it go or action things that you want from that because it's so easy to literally drive yourself crazy. And that's where I also say, I use the term crazy flippantly, but genuinely it took me sort of getting to my lowest point. And I've had a few low points similar to that before, so I kind of knew what to do. But that was a new iteration. And so having a trusted therapist or other sort of credentialed person to help coach me through that was really critical. And so I would say like developing those relationships before you get to that space is really important. And it doesn't have to be, anything too intense, but I would say that talking it out, airing those things, and then finding other support groups, whether it be, nothing too formal, or unless that's what you need and what you find. So for example, having like a core group of other female founders to speak with, whether it's just through WhatsApp or through more formal networks, I found those and trying them out and being willing to say, hey, this isn't for me. And moving on quickly. I think that's the other major point, but those have been critical for getting through, I think, some of those big decisions, whether regardless of your industry. I think that would be helpful.
I think what you said about talking it out or letting it go and having a very action-driven approach, I think that's super useful. I myself am also someone who can marinate, as you say, on something. And I've just realized for me, writing it down and then deciding to not take an action or to take an action and then just closing it just really takes a lot of kind of mental load off my own brain. And it just allows me to have more time to actually do things that's, important and that productive. So yeah, definitely resonate with that. Before we wrap up, Lily, I'm going to ask you our podcast staple. What do you think will enable more people to have better mental health?
I appreciate you asking. One of the most important things you can do is to be consistent with whatever practice you choose. So like you mentioned journaling, like I aspire to actually be able to write it out. I usually find I get to like a really intense point and then just like anger, right? And I think because like, as you just mentioned, it's so important to write these things down. And that's something that I'm trying to get to because when I'm consistent with it makes such a difference. And similarly, I think I'm a rowing coach outside of work, or used to be before work took over my life again. But exercise is extraordinarily important to me, and finding the right exercise that brings you joy, aside from not only the endorphins of the exercise itself, but something that you genuinely look forward to and see it as a release. Like the mix of those two, and with those two pieces, saying the key is consistency and something that works for you. That's how I hope people have better mental health.
Doing something consistently, something that you enjoy, and also having you on board of the directors, both for your personal and also your professional life. I think those are my main takeaways from our conversation. It's been, really, really such a joy having you on. Thank you so much for being so open about sharing your own experiences and really giving quite useful tips that other young professionals can also use as they go through their own career as well, and maybe come to different points where they felt that they want to pivot. That's a wrap for this episode of Low to Grow. If you learned something today, help more people to find this conversation by hitting the subscribe button and leaving a review. Keep growing, and until next time.